What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Empire of the Dawn, the finale to J. Kristoff's epic dark adult fantasy trilogy that began with Empire of the Vampire back in 2021, which I have proudly displayed on my bookshelf right here, along with the Empire of the Damned right here. But because this book's not coming out until November 6th, I'll obviously not be divulging any spoilers. That was one of the conditions for getting my hands on this advanced copy. But my battle plan for this video is to divide it into two parts. My intro is going to be for people who are totally unfamiliar with the series, and then I'll have a spoiler-free section for people who have already read Empire of the Vampire and Empire of the Damned. But I can go ahead and reveal this. Empire of the Dawn is an incredibly addictive reading experience. It manages to stick the landing, delivering a jaw-dropping conclusion with all the ruthless bloody combat and all the hardcore sex between supernatural beings that fans could ever ask for. There's also a series of massive plot twists that you definitely don't want to have spoiled, so be very careful when reading or watching any reviews between now and November. And I'm going to be extremely careful. I'm not even going to tell you like which emotions I felt toward the end of the story, because if I say an ending or a scene was frustrating or satisfying, then that's also in and of itself a bit of a spoiler. All I'll say is that the emotions in the last 200 or 300 pages were incredibly intense, but I'm not even going to tell you if I felt exhilaration or euphoria or depression and sadness, because I want people to be as surprised by all the various twists and turns as I was. So I hope you'll forgive me if I'm a little cagey at times about which specific emotions I was feeling toward the end of the story, but one emotion I can divulge is panic, because in the final 100 pages of the book, and keep in mind it's a very long book, 766 pages, but in the final 100 pages I started feeling this overwhelming panic attack that there wouldn't be enough time for him to wrap up all the dangling plot lines and give every character a satisfying conclusion. That's the sign of a really good reading experience, because usually when you get to the second half of a book, when you kind of get over that tipping point, you start to kind of race toward the conclusion. I started to do the reverse because I realized this was going to be the end of the story. I really tried to slow down and savor each and every single line, because I kind of ruined the first two by reading them too quickly. And I don't recommend that you read these books one after another. After I read the first book, I went straight into the second. And in hindsight, I think that was definitely a mistake. These are big books. They're a massive commitment. And I think it's a good idea to have a little bit of a palate cleanser in between these three tomes. And they are tomes. I mean, they're all big. You could bludgeon someone to death with them. But, go off and read a great Jim Thompson crime novel. Something short and sweet and really exciting, but something that's in a completely different style, a completely different genre. Because when I came back to Empire of the Dawn after a 6 or 7 month break from the series, and as I was going through the intro to all the characters, I was like, yes, I was so excited to get back into this world, and I was so excited to refamiliarize myself with all the major players on the stage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I made a promise that the intro to this video is going to be for the unconverted, for the uninitiated. So here's the official premise for the first book in the series, Empire of the Vampire. 27 years after Day's death, a mysterious phenomenon that has cast the world into perpetual darkness, vampires have successfully conquered humanity. Gabrielle de Leon, the last living vampire hunter, is held prisoner awaiting execution for killing the forever king, Fabian Voss. However, the undying empress orders Gabrielle to tell her personal historian, Jean-Francois Chastain, his entire life story. And as simple as that hook might sound, or that premise might sound, it actually applies very well to all three books. Although the second and third book bring in an additional person being interviewed by Jean-Francois. And I should add that at an unspecified time in the third novel, Jean-Francois managed to surpass or replace Gabrielle as my favorite character in this ongoing saga. But I'm trying to think of the best way to make the pitch for this entire trilogy for those people who are unfamiliar with J. Kristoff's work or his style. I'll say this. If you think of the genre of dark adult fantasy as something closer to a drug as opposed to a literary movement, well then these are probably going to be the books for you. If you grew up watching the original Vampire Hunter D from 1985 on repeat, you're probably the perfect target audience for this series of books. And speaking of which, the sequel, Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, which was directed by Yoshiaki Kawajiri, has a few characters that have a lot of overlap with some of the villains in this third book, in particular Fabian Voss. But obviously the Vampire Hunter D series has technology. It's futuristic mixed with the supernatural, whereas the technology in this series is much more rudimentary. It's basically cannons, rifles, and basically these holy hand grenades that the last Silver Saints wield. And yeah, I recognize that if I use the word holy hand grenade, people are immediately going to start thinking about Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This series has nothing to do with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, apart from the fact that there are some holy hand grenades used by the Silver Saints in this story.
We have the holy hand grenade.
Yes, of course.
The holy hand grenade of Antioch. 'Tis one of the sacred relics Brother Maynard carries with him. Brother Maynard, bring up the holy hand grenade.
And if you're wondering what a Silver Saint is, think of them as holy warriors who aren't necessarily holy in their demeanor or the words that they use. If anything, they cuss like sailors on shore leave, but they're holy in the sense that they have all these silver tattoos that have basically been like kind of burned into their skin. But when they're in combat, they rip their shirts off and the silver gleams with the holy lights. All the vampires and all their minions kind of recoil as these Silver Saints are hacking into them with their silver weapons. And in the middle of a giant battle of humans versus the undead, if you have a few Silver Saints on your side, one Silver Saint is basically the equal of having like 1,000 soldiers on your side. They're that useful in combat. But I mentioned Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust and its director Yoshiaki Kawajiri. I feel like if you like the movies of Yoshiaki Kawajiri, you're definitely the target audience for this trilogy. In terms of the combat, the sex, the tone, just the overall setting is very reminiscent of that kind of dark, demonic, dark adult fantasy vibe that he embraced in movies like Wicked City or Ninja Scroll. And obviously there's some variation in terms of like the genre and the setting, but in terms of that tone, Yoshiaki Kawajiri, if he's still alive, I think he's still alive, he would be the ideal filmmaker to bring these books to the screen. And I'm dreading the day that somebody makes a piss poor TV or film adaptation of the series. But speaking of film and TV, let me make another pitch for people to check out these books. If you share my frustration with contemporary film and television when it comes to their handling the fantasy genre, these are absolutely the books for you. Because while I love a good fantasy show and I love a good fantasy movie, but more often than not when I'm looking for my fantasy fix, once again, comparing this series to a drug, if I need my fantasy fix, it's in the world of books and video games where I find that fix, very rarely in the world of film and television. And one of my biggest complaints about the world of film and television and its handling of the fantasy genre is that in film and television, they almost never come up with something new or build something from scratch. Usually they'll find a popular series of books and they'll wreck it or they'll taint it or they'll change it. Whereas with fiction and games, more often than not, they're building something from scratch. And nothing impresses me more than an author who can give birth to an entire world, an entire tone, an entire feeling, and an incredible cast of characters that's not based on anything from the past. And admittedly, in the first book at least, Jay Kristoff steals a lot of dialogue from movies that he loves and adores. By the third book, that nearly goes away entirely. I mean, you'll occasionally hear a line like, enter freely and of your own free will, which obviously comes from Bram Stoker's Dracula. So he's still taking inspiration from great vampire stories of the past. But a lot of my complaints about the first book, even though I love the first book, but I did have a lot of reservations about it, nearly all those reservations have been erased by the time we get to book 3. And to be perfectly blunt or brutally honest, I can't think of a single production company or studio in the Western Hemisphere, especially in Hollywood, that would know how to adapt these kinds of stories, these kinds of books, stories that are this potent, this intense, because when the combat starts to unfold, it is as gruesome as any horror movies you could possibly imagine. Like, take the most hardcore anime that you've ever seen, and then let that unfold with like 100-page battle scenes with like siege warfare and castles and supernatural beings. It's just complete and total bedlam. And when it comes to the erotic side, I mean, Jay Kristoff is totally fearless. He will pause his book for like 6 or 7 pages to write the most heroic pornographic sex scenes that you could possibly imagine. I guess it's the one shortcoming of reading the story as opposed to watching it. You need some hardcore saxophone music during some of these scenes, because I'll say this is not a spoiler because I'm being as vague as possible. There is a sexual encounter, I won't even say who is involved, in the third novel, Empire of the Dawn, which goes for 6 pages. I went back and counted, and he's like, the heroic descriptions of the thrusting and the arching of the backs, and combined with the drinking of blood and all the orgasms. I mean, because in the context of Jay Kristoff's world, or this trilogy, you gain sexual pleasure, or you feel sexual pleasure while being fed upon. They call it the kiss. And so people have these like thunderous orgasms while they're giving their blood to these vampires, and the vampires are equally aroused and engorged. And it's some pretty kinky shit. I was about to say it's some pretty pervy shit. Doesn't come across as pervy. It just comes across as stories or scenes written by somebody with an incredibly active libido. Obviously, the sex drive of Jay Kristoff is alive and well, or at least the sex drive within his imagination is alive and well. But there was one scene of this book that was so intense and so over the top and so lengthy, I just started cracking up because it got right up to the edge of self-parody without completely like going over the cliff. But it's insane. And once upon a time, erotic vampire movies were almost a genre unto themselves, especially in the early 1970s. Movies like Vampires by Jose Ramon Larraz. That's my favorite example of combining like the best of horror and the best of erotica all into one movie. But that period has a lot of close rivals. Or movies like Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. While I wouldn't describe it as an erotic vampire movie, when it chooses to be erotic, Francis Ford Coppola absolutely holds nothing back. And those scenes with Monica Bellucci, like if you like that scene where Monica Bellucci is feeding upon Keanu Reeves and he's into it, but she's kind of snarling and growling and making his cross vanish. There are a lot of scenes throughout this trilogy that are very reminiscent of that kind of atmosphere and style. But as exciting as these epic battles and these epic sex scenes might be while reading them, if that's all these books had to offer, it would quickly get repetitive and boring, and they would not be able to sustain your interest across, a story that basically lasts more than 2,000 pages. What really grabs me is the fact that this is a story where the good guys have already lost. This is a story about rival vampire empires or factions that are basically competing for the scraps of a dead world. And here we have one of the last living heroes telling his story, the story of his life, to a historian who genuinely wants to know for his own reasons as well as for the reasons of the empress that he serves. He's looking for certain secrets and clues in the story of the last Silver Saint that, how can I say this, may or may not allow some of these competing factions to gain the upper hand over some of the other factions. Basically, the Empress is looking for information or revelations or secrets that may give her faction the upper hand over some of the other factions that are competing for power. And part of the joy of this series is seeing the internal politics or the internal bickering between all these various undead factions, because there's certain bloodlines in the context of this trilogy, and each bloodline of vampires has different abilities, whether that's skin that's hard to pierce or additional strength or the ability to kind of manipulate people's minds. And the longer the vampires live, the more powerful they become. And so if you have a vampire that's 800 years old, well, it might take several Silver Saints in combat to even begin to have a chance at taking them down. And I think if Jay Kristoff excels at anything, it's these big dramatic momentum shifts in battle where if one of these really ancient vampires shows up in the middle of combat and starts talking smack, and the smack talking is glorious in this series, but he does these amazing things where a battle is right on the verge of being won, but then one total badass will show up and the momentum will shift. Or a battle's right on the verge of being lost, and then suddenly some incredible Silver Saint will show up, and then you have a momentum shift. And he's able to sustain these momentum shifts, almost like water sloshing back and forth in a bathtub, where you're getting incredible combat, but at the same time, incredible interactions between these characters. Or just the bickering and the shit-talking and the vendettas and the rivalries. They're all just glorious. It almost becomes like the world's greatest soap opera. It just happens to be a soap opera with people who have incredible personal power and weapons and like glorious like ebony plate mail armor and that sort of thing. The way he's able to describe the various figures, like I could read those descriptions for days. Just to give you an example of some of the dialogue between the various Silver Saints, while they definitely have a brotherhood, they also enjoy kind of putting each other in their place or kind of talking down to their apprentices that they might be training. And they'll use lines like, "You look like shite twice stepped in." That's a line that gets used over and over and over again. And they mean it as a term of endearment, but at the same time, it's a way of kind of poking fun at some of the older Silver Saints. So the filthy dialogue that's littered throughout all three of these books, I loved and adored it. And as long as I'm singing the praises of this trilogy, here's another thing to consider. Jay Kristoff is prolific as hell, and he's never going to leave his readers dangling with an unfinished story. There's an ongoing problem in the fantasy genre of great writers writing a couple books in a series and then either losing interest or getting writer's block or whatever the case might be. But the series are not, it's hard to recommend a series to somebody if you're basically, your pitch is, oh, there are a couple amazing books, but you're never going to know how it ends. And sometimes you'll get lucky, like Robert Jordan died while writing A Wheel of Time, and luckily Brandon Sanderson, who is like the world's biggest fan of A Wheel of Time and a good fantasy writer, was able to step in and write 3 books to wrap it up. But that's incredibly rare, and we just got very lucky in that respect. Like Patrick Rothfuss has owed a 3rd book to his Kingkiller Chronicles for a long time. George R. R. Martin has owed a 6th and 7th book to A Song of Ice and Fire since 2011. It's been 14 years since we've had another book in that series. And while R. Scott Baker, one of my favorite fantasy authors, while he's given us 7 amazing books in his Prince of Nothing series, or the No God series, however you want to describe it, he's been teasing that there's 1 or 2 more coming for many, many years at this point. With Jay Kristoff's series, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. I don't rank Jay Kristoff yet on the level of like my all-time favorite fantasy authors, but who knows what the future might bring. But at least he finishes what he fucking starts. And if you look at a list of all the books that he's written since 2012, I think he's got 3, 6, 9, 12, 18 books in 13 years. And these are not short books. These are, big ol' meaty books. Like, this guy, he's clearly one of those writers that is just compelled to write. He has no choice but to write. The stories are just flowing out of him. And so while I wait for whatever his next trilogy might be, I might have to go back and check out either the Nevernight Chronicle or the Lotus War series. The Lotus War series was his first trilogy, but I've heard really good things about the Nevernight Chronicle. But in any case, I'm just glad that I've got basically 15 other books to keep myself busy with while I wait for whatever he wants to write next. But perhaps at this point I've said enough to try to lure the unconverted into trying this trilogy for the first time. Let's shift gears into my non-spoiler review for those people who loved Empire the Vampire, who loved Empire the Damned, who are eagerly looking forward to this book, but absolutely want nothing spoiled, not a single detail. And also, I want St. Martin's Press and aka Minotaur to give me access to more books in the future to review on this channel, and so I'm absolutely going to follow the strict letter of the law when it comes to all the various instructions and whatnot that they sent me when they gave me access to this book. So what can I say for people who love this series, who are hungry for some information but want nothing revealed? I think the highest piece of praise I can offer about the third book is that, like, in the last third, there's so many twists and revelations and reveals and surprises that I had to pause and reconsider some of my criticisms from the second and third book. I honestly have a lot of criticisms throughout all three books, but it's so addictive and so compellingly written and so entertaining that I'm happy to overlook a lot of my petty grievances towards some of the flaws that I perceive in the overall narrative. But when I got to the end of the third book, I was like, you diabolical motherfucker. I'm actually going to have to at some point go back and reread all three books to see which criticisms that I might have still remain. And that's hard to do. Usually after you've spent a couple thousand pages in the company of a particular narrator or a particular author, it will kind of exacerbate and enhance some of your criticisms as opposed to washing them away. Or who knows, maybe Jay Kristoff was just getting better as a writer over the course of these three stories. But I was slack-jawed with awe with some of the things that he came up with toward the end of the story, where I was like, oh my goodness. And just, I guess there's a danger there where if you're introducing twists that cause you to look at certain situations in a new light, you might potentially alienate some of the people who really love those earlier portions. So perhaps this will be a completely subjective reaction. But I think because the end of this book keeps you on your toes and you have to pay such careful, close attention, the last few hundred pages are going to be hotly debated by the passionate fans of this trilogy. And while I think that debate will be totally healthy and totally normal, for my part, it was just a relief to feel excited in the final third of this third novel as opposed to dismayed with how things were turning out. Like, if you're getting to the end of this giant saga and you feel like you're entering the best scenes or the most interesting scenes or the most intense scenes, once again, I'm trying to be very vague about my emotions I was feeling, but the fact that I was impressed by where the story was going as opposed to dismayed, it allows me to make the pitch for this trilogy to people with full confidence that I think they will enjoy the full saga if they stick with it, because there's nothing worse than a show or a movie or a series of books or whatever that kind of get worse and worse and worse as they go. And there are plenty of examples out there where the best they have to offer is early on. A strong case could be made for the final third of the third book being the most exciting and visceral and intense of all three books. And as fans of the earlier books are well aware, he likes to divide these novels into like book 1, book 2, book 3. Usually when he's about to switch narrators between Gabrielle and his sister Celine, there are a few cliffhangers at the end of the books where I was like, no, you can't switch narrators now. You can't go to another character because I need to know what happens next. But that's the best kind of emotion to feel when you're just hanging upon every word, just dying to know what happens next. But he's like, nope, you got to spend 200 pages in the head of another storyteller before you find out what happens next. But that's that's the best kind of torture that an author can offer. Once they have you kind of like in the palm of their hand, that's when you know a writer really's got their hooks into you. And if you've been following this series patiently for the last few years, I'm sure there's certain ongoing mysteries that have your full attention where if you don't get some satisfying answers, you're going to be pissed. And some of those mysteries might include the origin of Day's death, or the origin of Ashdrinker, or the complex family tree Gabrielle as well as Celine. Like there are a lot of mysteries that are going on and on. Or some of the I'm trying to remember what's been revealed by the end of the second book versus what's revealed at the beginning of the third book. But other examples would be what are the true goals and agendas of some of the really powerful vampires in the story, or what is the origin of some of Dior's powers that we saw in the second novel. Like all these mysteries, I'll say this, they're all explored. And I think you'll learn as much as you need to know without needing a full and comprehensive history or a guide to the entire history of this world. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but this is a rare fantasy series where I'm not craving to know every single chapter in the history of this world. Like when I get really invested in a world like R. Scott Baker's series or J.R.R. Tolkien's series, I really do just kind of pore over the history where I want to know the entire history of the planet, all the cultures and civilizations and that sort of thing. With this series, what I really like are just the characters. I like the style of dialogue. I like the style of combat. I like the style of the sex scenes. But I really enjoy just like what's happening in the here and now. And I want to know, like, it's a very plot-driven emotion that I'm feeling. I want to know what happens next. And I'm always having to like force myself to slow down and savor each and every single page as opposed to ripping through it like I did with the first two books. I really took my time with this third book, and I'm glad that I did. But I have a very different relationship with this style of storytelling versus some other fantasy series that I've fallen in love with. I felt perfectly well fed and satisfied with the amount of information I learned, but whether or not you would consider it a flaw that I'm not dying to know every little scrap of information humanly possible about the history of this world, I don't know if that's a criticism of Jay Kristoff or if he's just offering a very different style of storytelling experience. But since I'm talking about vague criticisms, I guess my biggest criticism of both the second book as well as the third book is that there are certain passages in these books where his strengths and his weaknesses are kind of placed side by side, where because they're being placed side by side, it makes them all the more apparent. And once again, this could be a totally subjective thing, but I feel like where Jay Kristoff really shines or really excels is with camaraderie. People in the trenches fighting side by side against overwhelming odds, and that those kind of bonds of affection that you feel between those warriors, that's incredibly compelling and incredibly convincing. Where I'm less persuaded or less convinced, or I find it less compelling, is when some characters have basically a sense of religious awe for certain characters or for certain moments. I don't know if Jay Kristoff has any deeply held spiritual beliefs, but when he's trying to convince me of the characters' deeply held spiritual beliefs in the context of these books, I just find it less interesting. It's very one note, like, where they just kind of like gaze at something in awe and wonder and saints be praised, hallelujah, praise the Redeemer, blah, blah, blah. I just don't get invested in any of it. I feel like Jay Kristoff probably just has more of a dark side. I mean, you look at him in person, like, oh my God, you're this 6'7" Aussie covered in tattoos. Yeah, he's probably got a dark side. But when Jay Kristoff is describing some horrible orgy of the damned where a bunch of vampires are feeding on humans and feeding on each other and screwing everything in sight and killing everything in sight, he really leans all the way into it and writes it in a very believable, addictive, and kind of intoxicating way. When he's trying to write a scene in a church where a bunch of people are on their knees and gazing at something in awe and wonder, it just doesn't have the same potency or the same grip. But who knows? Maybe other people are reacting to those scenes in a different way. I just feel like he doesn't handle earnest sincerity nearly as well as he does kind of a mean-spirited cynicism. And maybe I'm just more of a mean-spirited, cynical person, but if I were to call attention to one weakness in Jay Kristoff, which places him in a rank just below some of my other favorite fantasy authors, that would be one area where I feel like he comes up just a little bit short. And along those lines, what I think is missing from some of the pure and noble characters in this story are the kind of moral or ethical shortcomings that make some of the other characters much more interesting. I would say one of the greatest strengths of this series is Jay Kristoff's willingness and he leans into the idea of having his heroes do horrible things, reprehensible things. They have major ethical shortcomings. And when like the 2 or 3 or 4 kind of main central characters in this saga, the characters that we're rooting for to prevail, are willing to do things that might turn the reader against them, that takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery on the part of the author. And so I like the fact that like throughout much of this narrative, oftentimes as an author, he's basically out on this very thin branch over a cliff where at any second that branch might break and he might lose the reader. And I feel like that in and of itself might even be a spoiler. So I'm going to abandon this topic right now. So just as a way of reaching for a quick and easy lifeline to get me out of this quicksand, let's talk about the art with this book, because there's been a major change or major switch up with the art with the third book versus the first two, because Bon Orthwick handled the art in the first two books, and Jay Kristoff posted an explanation as to why Bon was not working on the third book. I think they're still marginally involved, but the great majority of the illustrations were handled by Gonzalo Mendivari. And sadly, because this is a review copy, the art that I got to see was in black and white, not in color. And here's an early example of some of the black and white art that I was seeing. And Jay Kristoff occasionally will post some of this art on his social media profile, so it's not a spoiler share in this. But the rest of the book, whenever I got to a point where there was supposed to be art, it would look like this. It would basically just show a placeholder where the art's going to go. So perhaps my experience with reading this book would have been further enhanced if I'd had access to all the art. But I can't wait for my my official hardcover copy to arrive in November, because I read this book primarily in the bathtub, like every evening over the course of the summer. And if you read a book in the bathtub over the course of a couple months, the steam and the heat from the water will basically eat your book alive. As you can tell, like the book's already in rough shape, and like the paper of the cover is kind of coming to pieces. I'm looking forward to having a pristine copy of the book where all the art is in perfect condition. But obviously, anytime you're dealing with a fantasy series where you suddenly change up the artist, you run the risk of possibly alienating people who have fallen in love with that original style, that original vibe, because the art sets up certain expectations. Like, one of the reasons I got into reading fantasy books in the first place was because in the mid-1980s, the Dragonlance series came out, and every single cover of the first 6 books was done by Larry Elmore, and it was like, it just immediately established the tone, the vibe, the atmosphere, and the expectations for this little 10 or 11-year-old reader, however old I was at that time. But what I'm about to say might sound a little heretical to diehard fans of the first 2 books in the series. I actually prefer Gonzalo's art over Bon's art. Bon's art to me was always a little bit too kind of young adult in tone. And I recognize there are probably plenty of people who like young adult fiction who are discovering slightly or much more adult fiction in the context of Jay Kristoff's work. But those initial books, I always liked the art, and occasionally there would be certain images where I was like, God damn, this is incredible. But of the few images by Gonzalo that I've seen for this third book, I have to say, I hope that Jay Kristoff will stick with Gonzalo moving forward, whatever the style and tone or topic of his next series of books might be. And as long as I'm listing the book's accolades, there's another ingredient which I really responded to, where it very carefully avoided a trap that a lot of other fantasy series fall into, where toward the end of their big giant saga, it's nothing but big giant battles. And what I loved about this third book is that it managed to slow down and find room for smaller stories and smaller kind of cool classic scenarios that you would expect to see like in a Hammer horror film starring Christopher Lee, where they almost come across as like cool little standalone short stories within the broader context of this much bigger story. So no matter what kind of vampire stories you're into, sooner or later you're going to encounter a scenario that you find refreshing in this book. But as I scanned over my notes for this book, there's so much that I want to get into that I can't. I'm thinking I might have to circle back and revisit this topic. Maybe it won't be a spoiler review or a spoiler breakdown, but when I do my end of the year top 10 books that I read in 2025, this one will definitely be in the mix. And I'll probably do that video in December, so by that point, people will have had like a month to get up to speed. So maybe I'll tackle a few spoilers then. But yeah, if I go any further, I'm going to get myself into quicksand again and reveal something that I ought not to. But let me just close with this. I don't consider this to be a perfect series by any stretch of the imagination. And even in the third book, which I really, really enjoyed, there's an ebb and flow to it. There are giant sections which are less interesting than some of the other sections, depending upon who is talking to the historian at any given time. And so it's not a total home run, but the scenes that are good are so fucking good that they erase all my other complaints, or nearly erase all my other complaints. There are moments where characters are reunited, or moments where certain villains or heroes will either die heroically or die in brutal fashion, where those scenes are so intoxicating and so intense and so exciting, where you forget whatever lingering reservations you might have had in the pages leading up to it. And there are so many surprises. You would think that a book filled with so many surprises and revelations that you would kind of get numb to it, but nope, right up until the very end, I was like, oh my God. Oh my God. And I kept having to like kind of put it down and like kind of walk around, like kind of process what I just experienced. So Jay Kristoff, he's the real deal. And as somebody who's been reading and watching and just loving the fantasy genre their entire life, I mean, whether it's video games, movies, TV, books, whatever, in the last year, it's just been a relief and a joy to discover a new author that I want to follow for the rest of my life. He's 3 years older than I am, and so I hope he will live just as long as I do to keep giving me great, entertaining experiences. But I would say he's up there with a writer like Joe Abercrombie. I really love Joe Abercrombie. Earlier this year, I reviewed his book, The Devils. I think Empire of the Dawn is stronger than The Devils. And The Devils already got acquired by James Cameron to be adapted into a movie possibly at some point by Lightstorm. That was a huge win for Joe Abercrombie. I'm kind of secretly hoping that some production company will swoop in and write a giant check to Jay Kristoff to get the rights to the series, but will never actually follow through and make a terrible show or a terrible movie, because I just don't trust anybody in Hollywood right now to adapt this story faithfully. They don't have the courage or the balls or just the kind of the integrity and the appetite for darkness to adapt these kinds of stories to the degree that they should be. But maybe there's somebody over in Japan or South Korea that can make a great animated series. Then perhaps I might be willing to concede that somebody might have the talent or the chops to bring it to the screen. But for now, I'm just content with the fact that there is a cool new trilogy of books about the supernatural and medieval fantasy colliding together and just either fucking or fighting their way to the conclusion. And it's just been an absolute joy and a pleasure reading this series. So I hope I have done a relatively good job of persuading people to check out the series. And if you are a diehard Jay Kristoff fan who's been following this stuff since the beginning, let me know, what are his essential books apart from this trilogy? And furthermore, what are some upcoming books in either the fantasy or horror genre that I should consider reviewing on this channel? And this channel will always be primarily devoted to my love of movies. And obviously, it's much quicker and easier to review a movie than a 700-page book. I mean, a movie takes 2 hours to watch. You spend a couple hours making a video about it, and you're finished. I didn't read this book in 7 hours. It was a commitment over the course of the summer. So I would never want to completely, totally kind of redirect all my energy just into reviewing books. However, because film and television never provide me those storytelling experiences that I crave within the fantasy genre, I'm much more open to reviewing great fantasy books as opposed to books in other genres. So along those lines, let me know what you think down in the comments below. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. And I'll be back at y'all talking about some more books at the latest at the end of the year when I do my top 10 books that I read in 2025. I've already got 10 books that I'm happy to talk about, but I might discover some new books between now and December that might shove some of those other books aside. Or who knows, maybe there'll be some other new novels between now and December that I want to review on this channel. But I can't thank you enough for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.